There was something that you mentioned because I saw clips of your Dr. Phil interview, and you mentioned to him about this phrase, words are violence. And we hear this phrase over and over and over. And what you've done is you've used your clinical research to actually unpack the psychology of what's going on here with these people who actually believe this, and in fact, how it's leading to unhealthy outcomes for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So people who love that slogan, words are violence, I mean, I try to be charitable and assume that maybe they're coming from a good place, but they should know that this actually backfires and has the opposite effect, because the way we reduce violence is through dialogue. Violence increases when dialogue ceases. So when we use phrases like words are violence to try to shut down people that we disagree with, we're actually priming the pump for violence. So we definitely want to keep the dialogue going, like Charlie Kirk always said.
Well, say, now you mentioned you're priming the pump for violence. Walk me through that phrase. What does that mean, priming the pump?
Yeah, so as a clinical psychologist, if I'm working with violent offenders, or you're working in prison populations, or even just, regular people with anger management problems, one of the first things that you want to do is to teach them how to have dialogue when they are upset, because even a mom of a toddler will tell you that using your words will help you to resolve conflicts and not escalate things. When people shut down and they stop talking, that's when they're more prone to what psychologists call acting out their feelings. That's when they're more prone to violence. It's what any, peace negotiator or anything like that will tell you is step one, you want dialogue. So words are not violence. In fact, again, when the violence increases when dialogue ceases.
Well, and in fact, Charlie had said that himself. He said, when I've just pulled up the quote here, when people stop talking, that's when you get violence. And in fact, this book that you've written actually backs that up with the clinical research.
Yes. And thank you so much for your kind endorsement of the book as well, Jack. That meant a great deal to me. But yeah, I felt I had to write it as a clinical psychologist because unfortunately, free speech has become a politically coded issue. It really should be neither owned by the left nor the right. It's for all of us. But for whatever reason, right now, it's coded as a right-leaning, value. And my profession, clinical psychologist, literally leans 90% plus to the left. So I think that might be why my profession is more pounding the drum about hate speech and bullying, and maybe even leading the charge on some of this silencing of dialogue. But what I know as a clinical psychologist is the opposite, that we should be promoting free speech. That's actually how we reduce, bullying, and if there's hate speech or misinformation, experts will actually tell you it's through dialogue, even if it's like a KKK member or former jihadis, they'll all tell you that they healed through dialogue. So I don't know where this words are violence nonsense is coming from. It's misguided at best.
And it seems that, and I've done, my fair share of, trying to unpack this pathology, but, it seems to come from a place where thinking that people's feelings being hurt is the same as physical violence, that you've done, because there's this word harm. And they'll say, well, you did me harm because you harmed my feelings. Therefore, you're doing harm to me. Therefore, for example, Charlie Kirk speaking out on the transgender issue, which is obviously something that he's been quite vocal about, is in fact a form of violence to the transgender community. And this is why in the wake of Charlie's murder, even before anyone had been identified, there were a number of people who suggested that perhaps because we've seen so much violence from the trans community, that this could, and in fact, just days before they had shot up a school, or this one trans offender, that perhaps there could be a connection. And in fact, there was. It was someone who was in a relationship with a transgender boyfriend. And so, where does that idea come in, that you harming my feelings is something that's causing me physical harm? Because you do tend to see this, and I'm just going to call it out, you tend to see it with a lot of Gen Z, where they're so worried about having their feelings hurt that they almost become, conflict aversive.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it is, of course, it's literally psychotic. And in psychology we call it psychotic when something is, broken from reality. And so it's actually a very anxiety evoking way to live your life, to think like, God forbid somebody says the wrong thing to me. It's like I've been run over by a car, right? Or to think, God forbid, that you say the wrong thing to somebody else, then it's like you've run them over with a car. Now you bring up the trans issue and the overlap, which I think is interesting because, frankly, there's a lot of psychoticism, I think, within the trans movement, because, again, going back to this idea that psychotic essentially means out of touch with reality. And there are some people who identify as trans that say, like Caitlyn Jenner, that says, I know I'm a man who has had cosmetic surgery. Like, Caitlyn knows what he is. But there are many trans people who believe that through their surgeries or whatever, that they literally magically become a member of the opposite sex, which, I would say is a psychotic belief. And so it is interesting, as you said, that there is this overlap with the violence. In fact, when Governor Tim Walz signed into law, making Minnesota a sanctuary state, there was a Minnesota lawmaker in the background photo with a T-shirt that said "Protect trans kids at all costs," and it had a bloody knife on it. There's also a lot of medication, obviously, going on within that community, and some of that medication could even have side effects that could lead to additional psychoticism as well as potentially violent behavior, especially if they say anybody who disagrees that I'm, gender is, quote, threatening my existence. That's setting up self-defense language. To your point, this idea that these words are, quote, harming me on a physical level, that's really broken from reality because it's just obviously not true.
Well, and because, I think to so many people, obviously myself included, you ask what could possess someone to climb a roof at the middle of a peaceful college campus and, to plan an act as heinous and unspeakably evil as this. And something that I've always said is, well, they don't think they're evil. And I'll say this as a guy who served at Guantanamo Bay and came face to face with, you just mentioned jihadists. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I've been up close and personal with those types. And again, they don't think they're evil. They think it all rationally flows logically from their train of thought. And so you have to sort of unpack that to understand why they're doing what they're doing.
Totally. And so there's something in psychology called the secondary gains of victimhood. And so if they fancy themselves the victim of, this violent attack, then one of the maybe secondary gains to that is that it gives them in their mind an excuse to act out violently upon people. And it is interesting, of course, that when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, martyred, he was literally in the process. It was the first trans issues question that was posed to him. And then that very moment, he was in that process of answering, when his life was taken by somebody, as you mentioned, Tyler Robinson, that his boyfriend identified as trans. Interestingly, these gentlemen also apparently had some interest or connection with the, quote, furry community, which is another level of psychoticism, right? Like, again, this transhuman idea that we can just break from reality